Once upon a time, a terrible famine struck the land. A poor woodcutter's cruel wife convinced him to abandon his children, Hansel and Gretel, deep in the dark forest. Overhearing the wicked plan, clever Hansel filled his pockets with shiny white pebbles. As they were led into the woods, he dropped them along the path. Under the moonlight, the glowing pebbles safely guided the siblings back home. But the famine persisted, and they were led into the forest again. This time, Hansel could only drop breadcrumbs. Tragically, hungry birds ate the crumbs, leaving the children hopelessly lost. Wandering the woods, they stumbled upon a magical house made entirely of gingerbread and sweets. Starving, they began to eat, but were suddenly captured by a wicked witch. She locked Hansel in a cage to fatten him up and forced Gretel to do heavy chores. The near-blind witch often checked Hansel's finger to see if he was fat enough, but he cleverly held out a small bone to trick her. Losing patience, the witch prepared her oven. But brave Gretel tricked the witch, shoving her into the blazing fire. Free at last, the siblings discovered chests filled with precious jewels. A kind white duck helped them cross the river back home. Their cruel stepmother had passed away, and their joyful father welcomed them with tears of happiness. With the witch's treasure, they lived happily ever after.